I'm here to present a paper that we wrote over the last 6 months called Coping with COVID, and it's a descriptive study on Australian women's experience, particularly looking at their coping responses. Historically, we know that women tend to fare worse post and during shocks. And whilst most of the information that I'm reporting on comes from developing countries, whereby at the end of a shock, women have less resources to call upon. We know that this experience is currently being felt in Australia. So the recent ABS data looking at the household impacts of COVID report fairly substantial differences between male and females' mental health scores and their life satisfaction. Importantly, they show the uneven unpaid toil and the gendered nature of care, which may be increasing, particularly for women in heteronormative relationships. Answer the question before you can, why women? So in Australia, we've been very lucky in terms of our infection and our death rates. But it's been called an emotional leveller, in particular for women. And that is the reason why I am studying women's coping responses rather than men's and women's. Coping is the process of stress appraisal. So we encounter a stressful event, and there's two main positions that we can undertake during a stressful event. So we can look to the problem, and we may try to focus on reducing the impact of this stressful encounter. Or we may enact an emotional response, which means we focus on the feelings that the stressful encounter is causing us. Now, women are said to be more emotional in their coping, and this is put forward in a theory called the socialisation hypothesis. However, a different view is that women actually encounter more daily hassles, which then reduce their resources in terms of ability to respond with a problem-focused process. COVID provides us a really fantastic situation to study coping because it is it's uncontrollable in both situation and time. So we are able to look at the whether or not there's a change in the stress appraisal and the coping response over time, which is really useful. So what did we do? Like I said, it's a descriptive study. So we used a bunch of already validated scales. We looked at personality characteristics, demographic variables, and we used already validated questions from the Scrub study, which is through Behavioural at Monash Uni. And importantly, we use Carver's coping response scale, which is a 28-item scale that reduces it into 14 items. And they look at the approach versus avoidant coping style. We had 2 data capture points, one in June and one in September. And we used a repeated measures ANOVA. This will make a little bit more sense next slide, but we used an over 40 versus under 40 grouping variable. And we used the factors of coping, so the 14 different factor styles as the repeated factor. There was 3 components to the analysis. First, we wanted to know whether if overall there was a change in coping for women. Secondly, we wanted to assess the interaction of time and age, and we wanted to know the direction of the relationship to identify whether or not there was differences in older versus younger women's coping responses. The age distribution is the reason why we used a under 40 and over 40. So we had about 207 repeat respondents from study 1 to study 2. And you can see a bimodal age distribution. And we looked at a few different ways of grouping that, whether it was under 30s, 30s to 50s, etc. But the closest that we could get was under 40 and over 40, because we wanted to have a equal-ish numbers in each group. Importantly, we do see the changes in mental health and life satisfaction, which were reported when we were first designing this study. And interestingly, we also see an increase in risk willingness. The majority of our women fit the view of having multiple roles. They're in monogamous relationships, and close to half of them report responsibility for dependence. So the results, I'll just talk through them quickly. Overall, we found that younger women were more likely to enact a response, be it positive or negative. And we did find a trend for younger women to be more likely to use a avoidant coping strategy rather than an approach. However, the first slide I've pulled up is actually an approach coping strategy. But what we see here is at time 1 in blue, it's about the same between under and over 40. But in time 2, younger women are enacting the coping strategy more than older women. We see that again in the avoidant coping strategy of venting. So, and again in, this one's interesting because we also collected things in personality. What we found were 2 key personality traits to change over time, and one of them was conscientiousness. And the argument behind that is we've all become a little bit more conscientious. We're all having to be more aware of hand washing, having personal responsibility. Now, personality tends to change over years rather than weeks or months. So we're not sure whether or not this is sort of like a knee-jerk reaction in the data collection, or if in fact it is the beginnings of change. Interestingly, we see that it is the older women who are using or changing their personality a little bit more. This is my favourite. So we see a change in risk willingness, particularly for younger women. Why does that matter? I'm going to discuss that with you. So acute responses to stress are normal, but when we have a prolonged response to stress and something where we're seeing over time more women are using these avoidance strategies rather than oscillating towards a approach strategy. It's concerning because there were some of those early predictions about the long-standing consequences for younger women. They're more likely to work in service industries. If we see this increase in risk, it's likely there's an association with a willingness to use a more maladaptive coping strategy. Sorry, that was a big word. And we look at risk in terms of humour as well, because what we see is an increase in the use of humour. Some people might say, oh, that's good. Everyone's finding a way to joke through a not so great situation. But when it's associated with dark traits or maladaptive coping. It may result in an increase of behaviours that are detrimental to our well-being, as we have seen here. So that's where the study is heading. We also collected some data on the function of behaviour, so drinking, smoking, etc. But we can talk about that a bit later. Thank you.